Evolution of Hon-Choshi, written sloppily on a whiteboard. I had a request recently to discuss a little bit more about the various scales and modes of shakuhachi. So I decided to do a two-part series. So in the first one, just like I said, we're going to talk about the evolution of Hon-Choshi, which is the main mode in shakuhachi. So what is it? Where did it come from? And so on. A disclaimer is that, well, who knows? I might be wrong, but I think there's a pretty good evidence and a pretty solid argument for where I stand on the issue. So I'm going to tell you what I know. First of all, got to go back to before the Edo era, before the Fuke Shakuhachi, to the hitoyogiri, right? Because that is, I think, at least had some pretty strong influence and gives us a little bit idea of the musical landscape of the beginnings of the Fuke Shakuhachi in the early Edo era. Okay, so we'll start with myth. Okay, you've got a couple of myths that are going on here. So the sound of the hitoyogiri is said to have started with the sort of the bone of a golden monkey, and the sound that it made, imitating the monkey's cry. The Fuke Shakuhachi has its mythical roots in the this guy Chohaku, who was supposedly a disciple of priest Fuke of the Zen, the Fuke sect, the namesake of the Fuke sect of Zen Buddhism, right? And even before that, there's a myth about, well, who knows? Maybe it wasn't a myth, but it probably was because it involves the phoenix, and I don't know if you've ever seen one, but I haven't. Although the phoenix does have something true about it for sure. The scale of the hitoyogiri, which is not just the scale of the hitoyogiri, it's also a scale that's very prominent in gagaku and ancient Japanese music and Chinese music as well, for that matter. It's called the Ritsu scale, right? So we need to know about that before anything else. Ritsu, like that. That's the Ritsu scale. That's the kanji for it. So the Ritsu scale exists in partnership with the Ryo scale. Right? Ryo is written like this. Right? There's Ritsu and there's Ryo. And they are both very similar scales, and they came from the male and female songs of the phoenix. Songs of the male and the female phoenix. The male one is Ritsu, the female one is Ryo. Right? So I like them both, and they're both used in the hitoyogiri, but for our conversation, the Ritsu is going to be the most useful, so we're just going to talk about that one, right? The Ritsu scale sounds like this on a hitoyogiri. You notice there's a half step, and then a whole step, and a half step, and a half step. And again, with the ancient tuning is about 10 cents lower, or maybe it's more than that, 10 hertz. You'll have to check me on that. Yeah, 10 hertz lower. If A is the bass, A440 goes down to like A430 or A432, depending on who you talk to, right? So 432 hertz. So it's a little bit lower, but with that understanding, this A goes from A to B to D to F sharp to what? To G, right? No. To E to F sharp. Oh boy, I just messed that up. Let's try again. A, B, D, E, F sharp. And that's the Ritsu scale. Now in the hitoyogiri, the scale is transposed across the flute to create 5 different modes. And that's similar to what happens in the shakuhachi. But I want to talk to you about one of those modes, which is the doyo mode. In the doyo mode, we start the Ritsu scale here, right? The two bottom holes are open. So it's a scale of D, actually, right? And that sounds like this. Right? Do you hear that same scale being repeated in a higher register? First we had, then we have, and that's called the doyo mode. That is the mode that was used to create folk songs that we have from, for example, this book on hitoyogiri includes some folk songs, and they're all written in the doyo mode, right? There is also a older book, also dating from the early 1600s or the mid 1600s. That's the early Edo era, and all the folk songs are in that are also written in the doyo mode, right? That's the standard mode that they would be played in. So doyo mode sounds like this when you drop it down to the bottom of the flute as well. Right? That's the basic scale in the doyo mode. All right, so why is that significant? Well, it just so happens that that mode that would have been heard in folk music and would have been kind of a common thing, and especially something that would be very familiar to shakuhachi players, because this was called a shakuhachi before the Fuke shakuhachi came along. And what do you know? Right? We've got basically an exact mirror of the doyo mode being played in here, except the note on Ryo instead of being A is D, right? And at that it's a low D because we're using the old tuning, right? All right, so you may have heard at times as well that the shakuhachi's root note is actually not Ryo, but it's Re, and that's correct because, like I just showed you on the hitoyogiri, we're using the Ritsu scale with the root note on the Re position. Right? It's transposed up a little bit. Probably practically speaking, that's simply what people were used to doing at the time. It's what they were already doing on the hitoyogiri, so it became sort of the standard thing to use on the shakuhachi. That makes sense, right? And if you listen to that, if we start at Re, you can hear that Ritsu scale that I showed you at first, right? Being started on the Re position, right? And then if you go down to Ryo, of course, you get the same thing that I just showed you on the hitoyogiri, except just transposed down to a larger flute. All right, now at this point you may have some questions or you may not, but there's one thing that I have to note is that when I'm doing that, the tsu actually ends up being a chumeri, right? So in that scale, we've got a chumeri where the tsu is. No, not that. It's you can see I'm bringing my head down a little bit. All right. So you might be saying to yourself at this point, well, that's not actually the shakuhachi scale that we use. We usually either, well, maybe you use the Minyo scale with all the open holes. Or maybe if you're thinking about Honkyoku, it's like, well, no, but Honkyoku is like this. Well, that's what this video is about. When I started playing Myoan Shakuhachi, I noticed that the tsu was never as merry as I expected it to be on the shakuhachi music I was hearing on CDs. I think that the reason for that is because, well, it originally wasn't. if you read hitoyogiri books and manuals, sometimes they will also talk about the up and coming Fuke Shakuhachi that's been seen around in the early Edo era. Um, and you will find mention of pieces such as I think they may have mentioned Nagashi Renbo or Koro, right, which is ostensibly Koro Sugagaki. So if you take these pieces, assuming that they are at least have the same, or at least origins of the pieces that we play in the Myoan notation today, in various Myoan schools today, it really makes sense, the things that I was hearing and the style that I also play in myself, which is that we don't do the daimeri onsu. So since we were talking about Koro Sugagaki, let me show that to you. Most of these pieces are, of course, written in Hon-Choshi. But the difference between them and more modern Honkyoku is that they don't use that very deep tsu. And I'll stop there. That's just the beginning. But you hear, generally speaking, the tsu, when it's played not as a grace note but as an actual note, it's just that chumeri, right? We don't do that. Right, and again, we don't go. It's more. And some people might say, like, oh, they're just playing that way because they're tone deaf, or they're just playing that way because they can't get the meri low enough. Nobody can get sumeri low enough when they're first playing. Well, actually, in the oldest versions of these pieces that I know of, it doesn't seem like anyone was actually doing that. One very possible reason for that is that the Miyakobushi scale became popular in the latter half of the Edo era. So in the 1600s, as Fuke Shakuhachi is beginning, everybody's playing in the way that I just described. But as popular music starts to change, and people start hearing this and again, also as the Edo era government gets more and more oppressive, you had to rat on your neighbors. You had like kind of this sort of neighborhood watch, except instead of watching for crime, you're watching each other to make sure you don't say anything against the government, and you've got to report on your neighbors. It was called tonarigumi. Um, so it's kind of this totalitarian era where nobody can say what's on their mind. It'd be kind of like living in North Korea now, maybe, right? So if that were me, I'd want to find some way to express something. So hey, there you go. At least you can use sounds. Nobody can rat you out for that, right? So the sounds necessarily perhaps became a little bit darker, uh, a little bit more melancholy because that was accurate. So it's nice that that's around too. Sometimes you need to express things that way. So I like that it kind of changed that way. But I would still say that the beginning of these Honkyoku was a Hon-Choshi that included tsu simply as a tsumeri. And again, I'm not the only one who thinks this. Toya Deiko, who would be my grand teacher, I guess, he wrote some books about Myoan playing. Um, and he talks about, at one point, he says, our tsu is lower than Kinko players. And at first that didn't make sense to me because it actually, the tsumeri of Kinko players is much lower than that of Myoan players like Toya Deiko. But he wasn't talking about the tsu as meri or kari or anything. He was talking about just the tsu, right? In a Kinko flute, if you took the open tsu versus the Myoan tsu, right? The Myoan version is a bit lower, right? And because simply it's not even that it's specifically meri at that point. It's just that's where the scale is. Um, so there you have it. All right, so to recap that a little bit, and actually to add a little bit more, we've got the Ritsu scale, right, which was used in the hitoyogiri. That scale was used in a particular mode that was popular for playing folk songs and would have been kind of in the ears of everybody at that time. So then when the Fuke Shakuhachi comes along, they use that as the standard mode for their music as well. Um, and that results in something where you've got, rather than just open holes, you've got a tsu that's a little bit lower. And well, you may be saying, well, what about chi, right? So chi is meri, right? And the chi meri in both hitoyogiri and Myoan shakuhachi is a little bit difficult to define. The hitoyogiri, right? We have this. Right? The chi is very straightforward there, but we also have this note. This was called Ryu. It's kind of analogous to shakuhachi's U. And that pretty naturally creates a half tone. It was used as a tone color effect in some cases for the hitoyogiri, right? But it was also used as a note. There's at least one place in hitoyogiri notation that I found where it explicitly says that you have to play this at that half tone pitch. Right? So that we can say that basically hitoyogiri was something where you had plus this half tone, which again, maybe not surprisingly, is exactly what we use in Myoan shakuhachi. And apart from that, sometimes, again, in the Myoan pieces, chi will be played meri. Other times it'll be played kari. And that u will be played meri, right? And again, that seems actually consistent to what was going on with the hitoyogiri at the time as well. That's why a lot of these hitoyogiri pieces are a little bit difficult to put together, because that relationship between the chi, known as e on the hitoyogiri, and the u or the ru is a little bit difficult to define, because sometimes it's this pitch, sometimes it's that pitch, and the same thing happens in the Myoan pieces. Whereas modern versions of the notation do make them a little bit more, well, modern generally. Listening to older recordings, there's not even always a rhyme or reason. It almost seems to depend on the players, the flute that they're playing, or the feeling that they have in the time. Sometimes chi is a little bit more meri, a little bit less meri, depending on the flute that they're playing, maybe. Maybe it goes a little more meri, maybe it goes a little bit less meri. So that sort of meri concept is a little bit gooey, um, in many cases, right? But so anyway, that's what we've got. So we've got this sort of movable u and chi with a tsu that's generally tsu meri, and of course in the shakuhachi pieces it can kind of dip down, or it can be played kari a little bit as well, depending on the context. But the basic scale and mode that we play is like that. All right, so how is that different from what you may be used to hearing in recordings or in Kinko influenced schools? Well, for Kinko, we have the Miyakobushi scale is being used, right? That is basically using the same Ritsu scale that we showed you, except that the chi is explicitly meri and the tsu is explicitly daimeri, right? for Sakura Sakura or for any of the more sort of, I'm saying modern, it's obviously not modern, they're still very old, but the more modern style Honkyoku will use that scale. We can also guess that it's known that the Kinko players, Kinko Kurosawa, the first, the second, the third, and so on, these guys were living kind of towards the end of the Komuso era, and they needed to make money. You know, they couldn't necessarily make all of their money, or eventually they couldn't make any of their money doing going door to door and begging. So they had to find a way to make money. So even though it was technically illegal, it seems that it was kind of overlooked for them to be teaching lay people, right? So they were teaching shakuhachi, and they were making their money that way. If you want to do that, you've got to cater to what people want to hear. And again, I'm not saying that that's like a compromise. It's also could very well be that the people playing it found that to be more beautiful, or that's how they wanted to play it. So they played it that way. But again, if you're performing and if you're doing this, then it makes sense to be using the scale that people are used to hearing at that point. This sort of plain Ritsu scale would have sounded like something a little bit different by that time. So the pieces take on this Miyakobushi tone. And again, it's not like you've got to change the pieces completely, right? All you're doing is you're playing that su a little bit more meri. And that basically creates the change from that hitoyogiri influenced Ritsu scale to the Miyakobushi scale that was popular during the latter half of the Edo era. So all of that is to explain what we have in Hon-Choshi. Hon-Choshi is the standard mode, right? It's like the base mode, if you will. And Hon-Choshi is composed of the Ritsu scale or the Miyakobushi scale, and the root note, the beginning of the scale, actually occurs at re, right? So if we are to write that out, do, tsu, re, chi, ha. And I'm using obviously the notation from my own school, and gosh, it's bright in here. You see that? That's Hon-Choshi, and we've got ro, tsu, re, chi, ha. Some people will be calling this ri. Some people will use something different entirely, but I think you know what I'm talking about. Ro, tsu, re, chi, ha, right? If you're in the Myoan school, the tsu it sounds like a chu meri, right? Nevertheless, it's meri. And if you're in a Kinko school, it's going to be even more meri. Chi also will be played meri in both schools, sometimes more and sometimes less. But you basically end up having a Hon-Choshi where you've got ro, tsu, re, chi, ha, or ro, tsu, re, chi, ha. And that's your Hon-Choshi. We'll go ahead and make this re bold because that's the root. There we go. And put a square around that because that's where we're actually physically starting the scale on the shakuhachi. All right. So we're going to take that as our Hon-Choshi scale, and this will be the basis of our discussion for the other modes in the next video when we talk about the Urajoshi modes. All right, so I hope you enjoyed that. Sorry about the sudden change in lighting. It got really bright in here. Hopefully that worked out okay, and I'll see you in a little bit.